Hi, my name is Michael Lachance. I'm a Nebraska author. I live in David City, Nebraska. Currently, we're experiencing a little bit of a snowstorm. It's about 0 right now. It's going to be bitterly cold. But it's a great time to be in the library and do a reading for y'all. I'm going to do a reading from my book, The Treaty of Versailles, The Power of Love. The story evolved out of a trip to Germany. This book takes place in 1933 about a character named Erich, who's a brown shirt on his way to be a Nazi. And his boyfriend Nikki basically saves him by getting him to flee to Canada. I'm going to read chapter 8, a portion of. It's titled Stefan, Friend. It begins, after work, Erich enjoyed a nice conversation with the bank president and the success of Erich's work, which included some extra funds. They had lunch, and then he asked Erich to step into some shoes that required more time at the bank and some travel. But the bank president, Mr. Jean Lachance, was concerned with only one thing, that some new interests of the industry are in New York, and 2 of them are Jewish. This is not a problem for me, sir. Erich sat back, and it wasn't a problem. My concern isn't only for you, it's a concern for them too. That you can manage yourself well among them, and that they may say or ask something of your background. The desk in Mr. Lachance's office didn't appear that big until he finished what he said, and then the desk seemed as big as Mont Blanc. Erich sat up and took note. I fled Germany because of Hitler and the actions they took against. He hesitated to say what he thought. Then he said, the Jews. That should be enough to dissuade them from their concerns. And it has dissuaded mine. He said happily, and his desk shrunk back down. It wasn't so large or as big as Mont Blanc. They stood and shook hands. The account is yours. Erich was in such good spirits that he didn't want to go to the doctor, but promised Nikki that he wouldn't miss. In fact, he stood before the mirror in his office and said that very thing. I promise not to miss any appointments. So with that in mind, he said, Bonne nuit, Mash, to his secretary, and she congratulated him too as he walked from there to the lobby and out onto the sidewalk. The planned trip to Berlin was much better now, as they had the extra money to do more than they had planned. The cool breeze lightened his heart, as he made his way past the shops and people to the offices of Dr. Sherbert, Ph.D. As it was that day, he passed a cafe which had a wonderful espresso smell that came from the windows and filled the air. It was tempting to stop and get an espresso, but he was closed on his time and had to move along. 1 more block and he'd be there, but he didn't feel the desire to discuss things. He was on a high, and a good one to be sure, so it was harder to imagine going there in happiness to discuss or relive unhappy things or moments from his past. He stopped, got a cigarette, and stood just down from the doctor's office. The cigarette looked like it was held by someone else's hand. It looked detracted and distant, as if it was a foot from him. The hand moved, and a sensation of numbness came over him. The hand trembled now, as it brought the cigarette up to his mouth, and it was very much like someone else had to help him get the cigarette in his mouth. Just as it got close enough, the cigarette fell and blew out into the street. He watched it and did nothing. Damn you, Stefan. The words felt foreign, but they came from him, or maybe from the person who had the cigarette. Guilt rode over him like a tank over the countryside on its way to destroy the enemy. His face soured. He gritted his teeth and made a terrible scraping sound as the top row of teeth gnashed at the bottom row. Scrape. Nikki warned him not to do it because it would damage his teeth, but the action was not in his control. It was under the control of something deep down within him, and now it was out of control. He turned and punched the side of the shop, to the surprise and shock of some people who passed by. Stefan! His fists were so tightly balled that he could have smashed the wall down if he hit it again. Another hand came up and touched his shoulder. Monsieur, It va bien. It was the shopkeeper, an older man, short and stout. Monsieur. Erich turned and got the control back in his hands. Sorry, he said. Quoi? Désolé, je suis désolé. He said, I'm sorry. He pushed the man away and marched off. As he got back to the next block, Dr. Sherbert's office was just there, a few feet away. He turned the knob too quickly and the door got stuck, so he forced it open and something cracked. The door opened and closed, but it was not closed properly. He went up the steps and got to the hallway where he had to take a minute to gather his thoughts. He could not possibly go in the office of the psychiatrist and act crazy, he told himself. He leaned against the wall and then saw the sign for the washroom. Quickly he went in, turned on the water and splashed his face. It was then that he remembered his rock, the rock that Nikki insisted he keep with him for luck and to bring him back to a better place, the Evituri. He wiped the water from his face, felt around his pocket, and yes, it was there. He got it out and held it tightly. Soft, he said, and rolled it around in his palm, rigid but not sharp. The stone's healing properties began to work their magic, and he was calmer, more in this place than out on the street and punching at things. The breath that filled his lungs calmed him even more as he pressed the stone to his forehead, cool, soft. He opened his eyes and there was someone there with him in the bathroom. Startled, he turned and stared. Stefan smiled at him and shook his head as he pointed at the stone. Erich didn't say anything, but felt foolish now. He put the stone back in his pocket and closed his eyes. When he opened them, Stefan was gone. The few steps he took to the waiting area felt like a walk in a desert where his shoes weighed 50 kilos. He sat down in the waiting room and wiped the sweat from his brow. He'll be with you shortly, Mr. Schmidt. Erich smiled as best he could, and then it was time. Erich? Dr. Sherbert ran his hand along his mustache as a patient walked out trembling. Erich went into the office and the window was open to let the stench of the pipe smoke out. He went to the chaise as Dr. Sherbert closed the door. You've been smoking your pipe. I was inclined to say that you smoked a cigarette, but you haven't, have you? He went to his desk, got his pencil, a pad ready, and then sat down. Yes, Erich said. He got the chaise turned and then moved the curtains some to block out the excess light. He listened and the noises upset him that came up from the street. So he cranked the window so that it was only open an inch or so. It's apparent to me that you've had some trouble, Dr. Sherbert put his pipe in his mouth. Erich looked at his bookcase, so observant. He took a breath and held it. Would you like a moment before we begin? Dr. Sherbert asked, got some water and took the glass to Erich. Denk, he thought to speak German, and then he said thank you. He drank, handed it back, and then wiped his forehead. As the doctor went back to set his glass down, he took off his jacket and was covered in sweat. Dr. Sherbert noticed and took a seat. So, perhaps a few breaths to ease the tension, and when you're ready, you can begin. Thank you for listening in. This is the Treaty of Versailles, the Power of Love. It takes place just before World War II begins. You can find it at www.skipperpete.com on my website or any major bookseller. Thank you.